Okay, great. Well, I think I'll start here and then some more people will continue to filter in. Welcome everyone to today's launch event. I'm Oliver Hannay. I'm the managing editor here at VoxDev, and we are really excited to be joined by the senior editor of our latest VoxDevLit, Sandra Rozo. Forced displacement has reached unprecedented levels around the world, and in today's session, we're going to hear from Sandra about evidence from economic research into the impacts of forced displacement on host communities, and also explore the effectiveness of policies that have been designed to support both forcibly displaced populations and their hosts. If you have any questions throughout, please use the Q&A function on Zoom to pose these. I will monitor them and then pose them to Sandra at the end after her presentation. You can also vote on other people's questions if you'd like to see those answered. So yeah, please monitor that and be active throughout. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Sandra.
Thank you so much, Oliver. I'm incredibly honored to give this literature review on a topic that I have so much care for, and it's so dear to my heart. So first, I want to thank Guy Grossman, who gave me incredible suggestions as always, and also my research assistant, my host Urbina, for her excellent work. My hope is that this literature review is going to give an overview to bring viewers and readers to the frontier of research on this topic. That they get the main lessons from this research on policy actions, and that I can highlight some opportunities for future research. So before we begin, like the detail of the literature that has been written more recently, I wanted to clarify what we understand by forced displacement. So generally speaking, forced displacement is understood to the involuntary or coerced movement of individuals or communities as a consequence of violence, persecution, conflict, natural man-made disasters, human rights violations, or extreme crisis, social or economic. And there are typically four categories of forcibly displaced populations. So one is refugees, which are international migrants that are recognized politically in their country of asylum or where they're actually living hosted as such. The second one is internally displaced populations, abbreviated as IDPs. So typically we just talk about the three letters. And these are migrants, forced migrants, that remain in their countries of origin, but that are actually also forcibly displaced. There are two other categories. One of them is asylum seekers. They can be in their origin countries or in other countries, but they are trying to get their refugee status recognized, but it, of course, has not been yet granted. So we call them asylum seekers. There's other people in need who are forcibly displaced populations that politically are not, because of political dialogues, are not recognized formally as refugees, but that United Nations deems as population of interest, and are also kind of interested in counting in these numbers. So here I wanted to show you the trends of forced displacement since we have data. So this data is collected by the United Nations Refugee Agency, and it began collecting this data in 1951. So originally it was all about international migration, and in 1993 it actually decomposes on these categories that I just described. So between 1993 and June of 2024, we see an alarming growth of forced displacement in the world. So it has more than quintupled in these years. So unfortunately, the future doesn't look very positive in terms of the size of these flows, because every day we see new conflicts emerging, and there is, of course, the risks posed by climate disasters that might also increase this number. Today, nearly every continent in the world has forcibly displaced populations, and this includes top origin and top destination countries. So this figure is showing you the top origin and top destination countries. And one thing that I want to highlight is that this is a problem that is mostly originated and hosted in the developing world, like in the global south. Approximately 75% of international flows of forcibly displaced populations are actually hosted in the developing world. And this is not surprising. This is because these are the countries that sometimes have frontiers with the countries that are in conflict, and also the countries for which it's more difficult to limit or enforce the international borders. So the key message that I would like for you to remember after this presentation or when you read the literature review is that the data trends and the literature both point to the necessity to move from like research and policymakers to the transition from an approach that is purely humanitarian, in which refugees are not allowed the opportunity to search for their own income, to work, to a more self-sufficient approach where refugees and forcibly displaced populations are allowed to find their own income. So why? Why do we think this is necessary? Why the trends support this idea? So on your left, you're seeing that trends in refugee returns across the world, according to the data by UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Office. Generally speaking, refugee returns and resettlements are pretty low in history. And if you think about the last 5 to 10 years, they are lower than 3%. This means that less than 3% of the refugee population actually returns to their countries or their locations of origin. It's extremely low. So these crises are incredibly protracted, very long. 80% of these populations actually stay more than 5 years in their hosting countries. So that's like the first piece of the picture. But on the second one on your right, you're seeing that the funding that is requested by countries that are hosting these emergencies is going up. That's the bar, the two-color bar. It's growing, this need, this financial need. And the dark blue area of these bars is showing you the unmet financial need. That's also growing. For 2024, approximately 45% of the funding requested by hosting countries could not be met by the international community. So if we think about this, it is important to transition to a model in which refugees and forcibly displaced populations are allowed to create their own income, because that's the only way to make it financially sustainable from a human and also from an economic and financial point of view. Fortunately, we do see that globally, countries and regions, generally speaking, seem to be moving in this direction. So this is a very incredible index that is a public good created by Guy Grossman, Jeremy Weinstein, and Christopher Blair. And so basically it's called the data set of world refugee and asylum policies, and it's available at the Joint Data Center webpage of the World Bank. It combines 5 areas worldwide for all the countries in the world. And it's publicly available, as I said. So the first one is access. It reflects the ease of entry and the security of legal status that refugees have in these countries. The second one is services, covering the provision of public services and if these populations can access these services. The third one is livelihoods, representing their ability to work and to own property. The fourth one is movement, if they can actually move or there's incumbent policies. And the fifth is political participation, including citizenship and political rights. So basically, the authors take these data and they combine it in what is called a principal component analysis. So that's a mouthful, but this is just a methodology that takes the variation in each of these dimensions and combines it. And it's going to range from 0 to 1, where 0 is kind of very low rights, very low maturation. 1 is going to be a more inclusive policy. And so we see that generally speaking, most countries are progressing in these policies, and Europe and South America actually emerge as the regions in the world that have made the most progress since 1951. So this shows that it is possible to make meaningful policy advancements in the world. So what are we going to do in this literature review? So we are going to try to give or offer readers and viewers of this video a brush of the recent literature that is quantitative. That means that it is actually based or uses experimental method or quasi-experimental method that was produced between 2010 and 2024, and that it was either journal or disseminated in a working paper series. So papers that satisfy these conditions, and we broadly classify. The first one is the impacts of forced displacement in host communities, and the second one is how policies that support refugees and host communities affect, or what is the effectiveness of these policies. We call them first and second generation, and I'm going to structure the presentation in these two parts. So first, let me kind of give you a little bit of an overview of the trends that we see in these papers. So here we have two figures. On your left, we classify in time all the papers that use different methods, and on your right, you're going to see the aggregate number of papers that use each method across a period that we studied or that we reviewed. So generally speaking, we see exponential growth in publications in this topic between 2010 and 2024. And there is a shift in methodologies from traditional approaches like matching, like the green color showed here, and reduced form, to arguably more advanced techniques as difference in difference, which is the green one, randomized controlled trials and conjoint experiments, which is the red trend here, and regression discontinuity design, which is the blue. So that's more or less interesting. And the other thing that maybe I want to point out is that instrumental variables technique seems to be kind of very common across the time period, so the use of shift share instruments. The other trend is on topics. So what do we see related to topics? So basically, we took each paper and we classified its main research question in one of these topics that you see on your left. So again, we're showing on your left the temporal trends, and on your right, the aggregate number of papers in each topic. And I also want to highlight that there are certain papers that have more than one research question, so they will be classified multiple times in that case. So what we do see here is that it's a predominant focus on labor market topics. So that's the predominant focus throughout the literature. But there are other emerging topics such as social cohesion, the red trend here, wealth for children. For children is going to be the light blue trend. And basically what this is illustrating is that there is a recognition today of the multidimensional effects that forced migration has on both refugees and their hosting communities. We also classify these papers according to the population that they are studying. So there is, again, a lot of literature focusing on the effects of hosts, basically how these flows affect people living in the areas where they arrive, what we call host communities, the refugees themselves. So sometimes when I refer to the research, I jump and talk about refugee migration, and this is because the majority of research is actually produced on refugees. So it's very little on the other categories of forced displacement. There is some evidence, but it's not very broad. So a lot of papers on refugee, how does this migration affects them? And then some papers exploring the effectiveness of policies or flows in both communities. So earlier studies, what we call the first generation studies, these green trends that you see on your left, focus on the impacts of forced displacement, mostly on the communities where they are hosted, where they arrive. But recent research, the red trend here, has kind of become more involved in understanding how this migration affects the migrants themselves, refugees, internally displaced populations, asylum seekers. And there is definitely growing attention on the policies that affect and can support these populations of forcibly displaced individuals and their hosting communities. Okay, so with that, let me begin. So I said I'm going to structure the presentation in two parts. So basically, I'm going to give you the summary of the first generation research of these 250 papers, and then the second generation. First generation refers to the effects of forced displacement flows in host communities for the people that are living in the local communities where refugees arrive and are hosted. So I broadly divide these focus areas in four topics. One is labor markets and economic growth. Another one is public service provision. Another one is politic electoral effects. And another one is social cohesion. I want to actually highlight, before I move forward, something that I already said, but it is important to highlight. There is very little research on internally displaced populations, asylum seekers, although there are some papers that I will kind of highlight. The vast majority of papers and research are focused on the topic of international refugees, international forced displacement. So let's begin with labor markets and economic growth. So there are 4 points that I would like to highlight today. The first one is that the vast majority of research that we were able to find is actually concerned with identifying the effect of refugee migration on the impacts on labor outcomes for native local communities or hosts. And on average, what we observe in these papers is that they document neutral short-term effects on employment and wages for these workers. However, when we kind of thread more thin, and we actually, or these papers evaluate heterogeneous effects, there is small but negative effects for vulnerable groups, especially those who compete directly for jobs with refugees, including informal workers, other migrants, women and youth, and also positive effects for workers that have complementary skills to the refugees. They actually sometimes benefit and actually go up in their career, what we call upward occupational mobility. And this is also explained because of shifts in labor demand from firms, because refugees and forcibly displaced populations also consume and produce in these areas. So what about businesses and broader economic effects? In terms of businesses, we see a very similar story. So those informal businesses that are located in areas where refugees arrive or IDPs arrive actually see increased competition from informal, self-employed, forcibly displaced populations working in these communities, and they are sometimes affected negatively. On the other side of the coin is that formal businesses actually benefit from these flows. This is, of course, because of the consumer demand. They are also consuming in these areas, and the low labor costs or the lower labor costs that sometimes they offer. And specifically, in many countries, such as Turkey, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, we see that certain sectors grow more when there is refugee inflows. And this includes sectors, sector-specific that are related with services such as food, hospitality, and restaurants. And this is, of course, due to the rising demand and to the possibility of accessing people that can work at lower wages. So generally speaking, another key message that I want to transmit today to you is that in the medium to long term, for the broader economic effects, typically these papers document that the refugee inflows and forcibly displaced inflows increase economic activity and growth. So yes, it is true that in the short term, there might be some costs and benefits, but in the medium to long term, the pie grows. And this is because these individuals, if they are allowed to work, they are also consumers and they are also producers. So they are actually making economic growth increase. What about public services? So here we structured a review in terms of education and health, which were the sectors where there was more evidence. Oh, let me go to education. So in terms of education, we see a very, very intuitive story. So basically, when there is a huge inflow of refugee populations in hosting communities, if they are allowed to access the public education system, we see congestion pressures. But we see them if there is not an adjustment on the supply. So what will happen then is that typically there's going to be a reduction in quality and overcrowding, and some native students move from the public to the private sector, what we call the native flight. Of course, this is possible to mitigate, and it's intuitive how to do it. If there's more people, when there's an infrastructure expansion, or there is an increase in funding, these effects are not observed. So if we compensate and pair the arrival with more resources, and we kind of increase the supply, these effects are not observed. So one case that is super interesting is the case of Jordan, in which there was a double shift education program that was open in the afternoon for Syrian refugees, and it had negligible effects for Jordan students. In Colombia, there was another model in which Venezuelan refugees were allowed to access the public education system, and it was not paired in the short term with more resources, and that, of course, created these congestion effects that I was describing earlier. So what about health? So on health, we do see that because these populations are so vulnerable, oftentimes they arrive in really bad health conditions and they come with no assets and without access to health prevention services. They tend, or there is evidence, very solid evidence showing that they tend to spread viral diseases that are vaccine preventable. So one of the key lessons of these papers is that actually integrating these populations into the preventive public services is not only good for forcibly displaced populations and refugees, but that it can prevent negative externalities and actually the spread of these diseases in hosting communities. So it is very key to integrate them early in these preventive services and of course to give them public health access more broadly. So these kind of literature, generally speaking, shows that it is possible to include these populations in the public services, but of course it needs to be paired with a concurrent increase in the supply, more funding on these areas. And it can also, in the case of health, be beneficial for the local communities. What about the political effects of forcibly displaced population? Mostly here, the literature has been focused again on refugee migration, and we kind of divide it into groups. The first one is the evidence for developed countries like the United States, Europe, Canada. Generally speaking, with some exceptions, we see that whenever there was a huge inflow of refugees, voters tend to move towards the right and favor right-wing parties or anti-immigrant parties. And these effects are stronger in regions that are wealthier, where refugees might be perceived as an economic or social risk to stability. The political effects are also weaker in areas where there have been prior migration waves, suggesting that familiarity might reduce the opposition. So that's all for the northern countries. I think that's something that we see in the media, no evidence of that. Developing countries in the global south, where I have mentioned to you, the majority of forcibly displaced populations are hosted, are very different. So the first thing that is different in these countries is that in these countries, the left and right political parties do not have a huge linearity with anti-immigrant or favoring migration policies. So it's not a one-to-one like in the north that is a little bit more clear. So in that sense, the political effects that forcibly displaced populations tend to produce varies tremendously across countries and contexts. So I'll give you two examples. One of them, the first one, is where we see positive outcomes. This is a case of Africa, in which when refugee migration increases, it comes paired with humanitarian aid. And it is very salient for the local communities that there is better public services because refugees are there. And so not surprisingly, that actually improve the attitudes from locals toward refugees. In Colombia, for example, we see that when Venezuelan refugees arrive, there is a shift of voters from left to right-wing parties, but it's not because of the same factors that we observe in the United States, for example, or in Europe. It's more related to the fact that voters are scared to become a crisis like the Venezuelan episode. So basically, when they see refugees, it's very salient to them that the left-wing party originated this problem, and so they are afraid to vote for the left. And this is, of course, something that the right used during their political campaign. It was very effective. So these are different reasons why, or different contexts, and kind of explains a truly different scenario between the northern countries and the countries on the south in terms of their electoral reactions to forced displacement. So what about work on attitudes, perceptions, and general social cohesion? So here there is a strong focus on refugee migration more so than any other. And generally speaking, what we find is that cultural proximity plays a great role. So whenever refugees and hosts share cultural, linguistic, or religious similarities, these effects are, let's say, the resistance from hosts toward refugees is lower. However, generally speaking, we see that there is kind of surges of violence against refugees everywhere, including South Africa, including Colombia. But on average, we see that they tend to be less predominant in countries where there is closer cultural proximity. The negative attitudes, when we think about each individual, are more salient in individuals that are directly or feel that they are directly affected by these flows. For example, when they feel that they're in direct competition with the refugees for work, then they tend to have more strong reactions to migration. That's, of course, intuitive. And there was a recent paper, and this is the last bullet of this slide, that takes cross-country data for a 14-year period for low and middle-income countries in trying to understand if there is a trend, a general trend, when refugees arrive on the response to these flows. And they actually find that there are no systematic trends across these countries. So this is a super provocative and super interesting study. However, it only uses one question. The question is whether respondents consider their area a good place for immigrants to live. This is, I believe, a Gallup question. And so, although provocative, it would be really interesting for future research to try to see with more statistical information what are the heterogeneous effects by countries and what types of perceptions and reactions we get in the different countries where refugee migration happens or takes place. Okay, so with this, we wrap up the first generation paper. So let me kind of give you the 4 takeaways that I would like you to remember. So generally speaking, on labor markets, we see average neutral short-term effects, but they are heterogeneous effects by groups. Groups that are competing refugees tend to see negative effects in the short term, and groups that have complementary skills to refugees tend to be benefited. The same for businesses. Formal businesses, generally speaking, seem to do better when there are refugee inflows because they face increased demand and reduce labor costs. For public services, it is possible to include these populations, and actually very important to prevent health externalities. But it's also important to pair these arrivals with higher investments in supply so that congestion effects can be prevented. On political dynamics, we see very different dynamics in the developed and developing countries. On developed countries, we see, on average, of course, with few exceptions, that when refugees arrive, there is a move of electoral towards right-wing anti-immigration parties. In the South, it's more context-dependent, and it crucially depends on which political party originated the crisis, and also how it is paired with humanitarian aid and how salient it is for voters. And in terms of social cohesion, how do people react about integration and the views they have towards integration? That's extremely shaped by the cultural proximity between local communities and forcibly displaced populations. Wherever there's greater cultural similarity, it might be easier to reduce the opposition. Okay, so with that, we kind of wrap up the first generation evidence, and now let me jump to the second generation evidence, or what we call the second generation evidence, which are papers that were more recent and focus on the effectiveness of policies that are supporting both forcibly displaced populations and hosting communities. So I want to say something here, and I think this is something that I hope many of you are thinking right now, which is, what is the difference between an individual that is classified as a forcibly displaced person and someone that is poor and vulnerable? And is it possible to actually bring all the lessons that we have in economics from other social protection programs and apply it to these populations? So the answers to these questions is very related to 2 things. The first one is the high vulnerability of refugee communities. So unfortunately, displaced communities, IDPs as well, and asylum seekers. So they are populations that go through terrible trauma in their origin locations, leave all their assets behind, go through perilous journeys, arrive, and also face uncertainty on their rights and stability in the countries where they're hosted. Plus, they actually face discrimination, social cohesion challenges. So all of those characteristics are going to affect how we can translate lessons from other programs that are supporting vulnerable communities to refugees. And this is more or less where this evidence is trying to speak, the evidence I will actually review. So the first group of work is concentrated on trying to measure the effect of cash transfers for forcibly displaced populations. Generally speaking, across the board, in line with what we see for vulnerable communities that are not forcibly displaced, we see positive effects. So we see improved consumption and expenditures, enhanced employment outcomes, so better employment opportunities and higher wages. We also see that it supports the economic welfare of forcibly displaced population adults, but also their children. It reduces child labor and higher school enrollment. It is beneficial for psychological well-being, general happiness, mental health. But there is a challenge, and it is that, of course, the longer that you give the cash transfer, the better. But whenever these programs are not paired with transition programs that allow these communities or individuals to start creating their own income, then as soon as the programs are over, in Lebanon, for example, it was documented, the effects of the program are reversed and these individuals go back to their baseline levels. So what these findings are underscoring is that it is very important to design humanitarian interventions that temporarily support the basic needs of these populations, but we need to have in mind that this is temporary and we need to create at the same time some sort of possibility for these populations to create their own income by allowing them the possibility to work. Otherwise, we're in a situation where we will have to give them cash forever, which is of course unsustainable. So in that same line, there is a new group of papers showing that giving the right to work and facilitating labor market integration for refugees is profoundly impactful for them. So as I said, there is across the board huge evidence showing the positive effects of labor market integration on the well-being of refugees, which I think is intuitive for everyone. And what are the types of programs that have been evaluated? This includes offering skill development, offering job search assistance, or offering language training. And that has been shown to have very positive effects in higher income, in educational outcomes for refugees and their children, for mental health. And there is a fascinating study for Bangladesh that shows that even if it's not paid in a way, if it is voluntary work, it also has transforming positive effects for the mental health of these communities. And I don't think this is surprising for anyone, right? If you don't have aspirations and future hopes, then of course you mentally are not going to be very well. The opposite is true. Whenever there are restrictive policies implemented, there is a direct negative effect on the well-being of refugees. And these negative effects endure even after these policies are lifted. For example, delays in the asylum process are actually creating costs in the long term for the labor market outcomes of refugees in Europe. So now I want to tell you a little bit about some successful policies that different countries have implemented and programs, because I want to showcase that it is possible to actually move the needle in the knowledge, but also for countries to implement policies moving in supporting both refugees and hosting communities. So the first one is related to my work and those of my fantastic co-authors in Colombia. So Colombia right now hosts approximately, according to the official numbers, a little bit more than 2.5 million Venezuelan forced migrants. This corresponds to a shock of 5% of its population. So this is a huge shock. We're not talking about something small. Despite that, Colombia is one of the most generous countries that has implemented one of the most progressive policies in giving these refugees or forcibly displaced populations the opportunity to fight for the future and work. So they actually offered in 2018, 500,000 people the opportunity to work, to access all social public services, to access financial services, and to have free mobility. Generally speaking, there are very few refugee camps in Latin America. So they actually can move across the territory. So we actually embarked in trying to evaluate the effects of these policies. These policies were expanded in 2021 to include everyone that arrived before January 2021. We document negligible effects on hosts on their labor market outcomes. It is important here to clarify that this is not the effect of migration. This is the effect of people who were living in Colombia already and were actually granted the opportunity to work. So we don't see effects for the labor market outcomes on hosts. This is because the majority of them stayed in the informal sector, despite the fact that they improved their income there. And we also see negligible electoral effects. Colombians don't seem to oppose that these people are allowed the opportunity to get their own income. We see, however, profound improvements in migrants' well-being, a 48% increase in their per capita consumption, a 22% rise in their monthly income. We also see that the cost for the Colombian government of hosting someone that has no working rights and someone that has working rights is actually lower, because these individuals can actually contribute more, for example, with consumption taxes, and also use more preventive health services, which are less expensive than emergency services, which was the only thing they could access before. We see improved health outcomes for refugees and enhanced resilience to shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic. There was an overall reduction in crime incidents in the country. We see lower fertility rates for these migrants because they have access to family planning and labor market opportunities, increased entrepreneurship, and not only that, but other countries in the region follow through to the Colombian example, like Chile, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Peru. And now the region is leading on showcasing how these progressive policies could be successful. They are ongoing challenges, however, one of them being that the majority of this population remains in the informal sector. They have better incomes, but they are still in informality. Another very interesting study is the one in Kenya, in which this is a little bit more humanitarian based, in that mobility is not granted. Free mobility across the country is not granted, but there are two models in camps. One is the Kakuma model that is purely humanitarian, in which there are limited income generating opportunities, and the refugees, they are actually receiving in-kind food rations for survival. And there is another location called Kalu Bay, where they actually try to implement a model that was more development oriented, that allowed refugees to somehow create a little bit of their income. So they actually receive still cash transfers, but they are allowed the possibility to do small scale agriculture. And this has had profound effects for the refugees: better dietary diversity, improved food security, higher calorie intake, and of course, mental health of moving in a positive direction. However, of course, because mobility and market access is still restricted, there is still limited effects in terms of asset accumulation, non-food expenditures, because of these models. There are other type of very successful models that I wanted to highlight today that combine multiple support. So one of them is in Uganda, another one in Denmark. So in Uganda, experimental evaluation tried to measure the effects of combining cash transfers with group-based business mentorship. And this includes mentorship by refugees and hosts for macro entrepreneurs. And they actually find improved business outcomes and profits for these businesses, with mentorship actually providing added benefits, especially for male participants. And in Denmark, there was also a multiple support program that actually matched refugees to occupations where there were shortages, and trained them on those occupations. And this also showed profound effects for refugees. In the first year, their employment rates increased by 5 to 6 percentage points, and on the second one by 10 percentage points. So profoundly and provocative positive effects of this program. So what about trauma? I said that one of the things that differentiates forcibly displaced populations from more vulnerable poor communities is precisely that they face mental health issues and that they tend to be discriminated. So it is important to start thinking about what types of programs can address trauma and mental health issues. So it is very important to understand that mental health is not kind of only important for the well-being of human beings, but it also has unintended effects on labor market integration, success, education, outcomes, obviously for this population. So a recent study shows that a 1 standard deviation increase in psychological distress of any person reduces refugees' probability of refugees, specifically in this study, by nearly 12% and weekly earnings by 20%. So what can we do? What type of evidence has been created that can correct this trauma that these populations have faced during their displacement? So there's two very interesting novel approaches. One is to focus on the mental health of the parents or caregivers. There is two important initiatives being experimentally evaluated right now. One of them is already produced, another one is kind of being escalated and it's in progress. One in Bangladesh and the other one in Colombia. So in Bangladesh, the Rohingya refugees, they implemented a psychosocial program with Rohingya mothers. Rohingya are the population displaced from Myanmar to Bangladesh. And it was trying to reduce trauma and depression. And basically, it shows profound effects on their children's cognitive, motor, and emotional development. And in Colombia, more or less in the same line, a similar but very innovative program has been implemented by Andres Morgan co-authors, in they actually support the caregivers and give them tools to actually improve mental health issues and trauma. And it has also showed profound effects for their children. Another paper by Emma Smith that is very innovative is trying to show how can we overcome the stigma that is associated with using mental health services. And so she implements a field experiment in which she offers Syrian refugees in Jordan the possibility to access these services, but she does it by sending the information through peer leaders that are very well trusted and that they have a very good reputation. And this is coupled with financial incentives, and they do see, or she shows that this is actually very successful in increased outreach and increasing this stigma of accessing mental health services. So what about social cohesion? How can we strengthen or reduce discrimination for these communities? So in the first place, why do we care about discrimination? This is because it actually creates incredible costs for these populations. So it makes it harder for them to integrate, to have a job, to be happy, to join school, to have positive relationships with other children. So this is something that is important to also address for these populations. So promising intervention strategies and evidence that has been created, one of them is to train teachers. So a very, very interesting study was done by Alberto Lesina and co-authors, and Michela Canala and others, in which they basically implemented an implicit association test. So basically this was a test that was given to teachers, and then they show the teachers the result. And it enlightens the teachers about the fact that maybe indirectly or unconsciously, they are showing discrimination. They are discriminating certain type of students. So actually showing them and enlightening them about the behaviors that maybe were not conscious reduces the grade gap between native and immigrant students. Another very interesting study was done in Turkey, in which there was, let's say, a training that was also given to teachers, and they actually make them more aware about the different cultural differences that children can have. And that was very successful in reducing the absenteeism gap between native and refugee students. And it lasted subsequent years after the intervention rolled out. What about adults? Okay, so this is all cool, but how can we improve the integration or the social cohesion or the reactions and attitudes of hosts or adults in these locations where refugees and forcibly displaced communities arrive? So there are two groups of literature that are kind of interesting and promising. One is done by Thomas Jean and co-authors, in which they show in Uganda that when you pair programs with information to hosts that the money or the program that they are receiving is there because there is humanitarian support coming for refugees, immediately that shifts the attitudes and reactions of the people that are being benefited by this program towards these communities. In other words, when the benefits of hosting these communities are very salient, and this is in line with the paper by Yang Shu that I mentioned earlier, and Guy Grossman on Africa, in which where there is very obvious benefits that are salient to the communities of hosting these populations, they tend to become more positive toward them. There is also promising evidence on perspective taking. So basically, can we actually try to make the communities that are living in these areas take the perspective of a refugee or forcibly displaced individual and step into their shoes imaginatively, or through a video or through some online exercise? It is very promising. The evidence there. It has shown that it can shift, at least in the short term, the perceptions that these communities have toward refugees and migrant communities. In fact, it can also be done online. This is shown in Colombia, demonstrating that this can be done at low cost and in a scalable way. However, more research needs to be done to understand if this is short-term lived, or if we actually follow these people in time, if this would actually be maintained. There are other 3 points that I would like to make on this topic. One is that there is kind of mixed results related to the effects of intergroup contact. So what is intergroup contact? It's what it sounds like. We're gonna group together refugees or internally displaced populations, forcibly displaced populations, with local communities in a positive environment, and try to measure if that increases social cohesion between the groups. So in Mozambique, there is a very interesting study that combines or allows internally displaced populations and local natives to sit down and have structured conversations about problems in the community, for example. And it actually shows tremendous positive effects, reduce discriminatory attitudes, and strengthen trust between groups, which is a great thing for reconstruction. However, there is other paper in Afghanistan that shows that when programs for vocational training are actually used as an opportunity to mix IDPs and locals, there is not really a shift on this prolonged contact on their views of locals toward the IDPs. So kind of mixed evidence, and there's a lot of opportunity to understand what conditions facilitate it. So here I think a very important point to move forward. The second one is I think number 4 here, what we call inclusive approaches. And this is pointing to the fact that, again, when there is a very salient point that support for refugees creates unintended or actually with the objective of moving benefits for the hosts, it of course makes their attitudes move in a positive way toward refugees. So for example, in Lebanon, there was a paper that evaluated the effects of cash transfers only for refugees on the local perceptions of natives toward refugees. And what they find is that because this cash transfer actually create indirect positive effects for people living in these communities, like there was more money, and of course that indirectly benefited a lot of the local communities, it actually reduced the anti-refugee hostility. There is another paper in Mozambique that actually offers cash transfers as well, but both at the same time. Refugees and hosts work together in this program, they receive the benefits. And here, this also shows improvements in trust and social cohesion. However, it's very fragile, the results of this evaluation, because whenever there was a crisis, there was a climate disaster that happened during the implementation of this randomized control trial, it actually reversed the effects very quickly, suggesting that in times of austerity, it is difficult that this tension between groups can become more difficult. And the last piece of evidence that I want to mention today, which I think is very important also for policymakers and program design, is one impact evaluation that we did together with the team of SIGA, Edward Miguel, Emma Smith, and others in Jordan, where there was a housing subsidy that was randomized and evaluated experimentally. This housing subsidy was given to Syrian refugees. Interestingly, what we find in this paper is that because this was a very salient program, and local communities, people who live around the refugees, were not included as potential beneficiaries of this program. This program actually created increased tensions between local Jordanians and Syrian refugees, not only for adults, but also for children, and it actually lasts years after the program is implemented. So this is a cautionary tale that it might be better to increase this to include these populations in what our social protection regimes are available, instead of creating parallel systems that exclude locals and other vulnerable communities, because those type of programs can create resentment. Okay, so now let me kind of wrap up with the key takeaways of this literature. So I would say the first 3 points that we're kind of pointing out in this slide are trying to suggest that humanitarian support is very important, but that it needs to be paired with programs that facilitate the economic integration for these populations, so that they can someday, or hopefully in the short term, create their own income. Otherwise, it is unsustainable. We cannot forever give them money and not let them work. And there are 2 other points that are very important. The first one is, of course, that mental health needs to be taken into account with the program designing, because this is a huge issue for these populations. So we need to have more holistic approaches that take into account that this is a problem and something that needs to be addressed. That it is important to apply inclusive policy approaches where we're not excluding the host communities from programming, because it can create more social tensions. And that discrimination needs to be addressed, because it is also going to complicate the economic integration for these populations. All right. So now I'm going to try to offer you some conclusions.
I think, could you reshare your screen quickly? I'm not sure. It seems to just have gone off.
I'm so sorry. You want me to share?
Yeah, could you just share your screen again, just so we can see the slides?
Of course, yeah. No problem. Are you seeing it now? No. All right, let's see. Okay, good. So I think one of the messages that I wanted to send today, which is very, very important, is that there is no solution that will fit all the contexts. And so we cannot say, okay, this works in Colombia and Uganda, let's do it everywhere. Because the populations are so different, we of course need to take into account the local resources, the institutional capacity, the cultural specifics, to design programs that are going to be beneficial in each country. However, it is important to see these countries like Colombia and Uganda, who have limited resources and are hosting tremendous numbers of these populations, as examples, that it is possible to have inclusive models, and that actually it will allow and facilitate economic integration and financial sustainability of hosting these populations. There are other countries moving in this direction. For example, Kenya is by little kind of moving toward more economic integration of these populations, and Ethiopia, at least in paper, has passed very progressive laws that will allow the integration of refugees. There are other countries that take more gradual approaches, like Jordan and Turkey, that actually offer some work permits with certain paperwork that needs to be submitted, and also allow refugees to have free mobility in the country. So I think there is all sorts of approaches that countries can take, but what is important to generally have in our minds is that having models in which we don't allow these populations to create their own income is completely unsustainable from a human point, but also from a financial point. So I think that's one of the 4 conclusions that I wanted to offer. The first one is we need to bridge humanitarian aid to a self-reliant approach. It is important, of course, in the short term to support refugees, help them, but we need to pair these initiatives so that they can graduate sometime from these supports. There are initiatives that I have mentioned today that are very promising, like skill training, giving them gradual or total labor market access. And as I said before, there are countries that have limited resources, that are not super rich countries like Colombia and Uganda, that have shown that it is possible to implement these models. I guess there is more research that needs to be produced, but I think history will show that this was a positive approach. The second conclusion is that we need to implement inclusive models. Again, we need to create models in which hopefully these populations are just integrated in whatever social protection framework there is in that country and not create a parallel support, because that creates resentment in communities, which is of course intuitive, no? And then the two differences that very importantly differentiate sometimes forcibly displaced population from other vulnerable groups in any country are the mental health issues and the discrimination that they face. So for mental health, it's super important to try to see if we can implement holistic approaches that actually incorporate mental health issues for these populations. And for discrimination, we cannot ignore it because it's going to limit their integration, their economic success in these countries, and we need to try to implement programs to reduce that. So what are potential directions for future research? So in our review of these papers that have been recently produced, it became very clear that there are 4 topics that are almost not mentioned. One of them is what happens in origin countries. So people live on what happens in origin countries. Of course, there is the research on remittances and brain drain, but that's it. We know not very little about origin countries. The second is on what happens with displaced children. So it's very important to understand how do we overcome the risk that these populations become a lost generation. So how do we support them? How do we, what are the types of policies that will help them? Very little evidence on the effects and policies that can support internally displaced populations and return migrants. And I think it would be super interesting in the future to try to understand what are the impacts of integrated programs like that combine labor market with mental health interventions and social cohesion, to try to see if we can think of more holistic approaches to support these populations. And with that, I will close. I'm incredibly thankful for this opportunity. Here's my email in case you have any questions, please follow up.
Thanks so much, Sandra. That was really, really interesting. So we have had quite a few questions, so I'll try to get around to some of them quickly. We had a couple focusing on kind of the first generation of research that you highlighted. So we had one from Alice who basically asked about regarding the impacts on host communities, whether there's any kind of evidence or studies on the crowding out of housing services, and whether that kind of affects people's attitudes. And then we also have a question from Hamadou about whether there's kind of congestion in schools in the hosting communities. And he also asked specifically about whether there's any evidence of that in the Sahel. So I don't know if there's any specific evidence, but yeah.
Let me, if I can make this too, so that I don't forget, and then you can let me know the others. So yes, there is evidence on both. So for housing markets, there is a paper written for Jordan. I actually was author with Michaela Sbiachi. And what we show there is very similar to the story that we see for education services, which is that whenever there is a huge inflow of forcibly displaced populations, in this case, it was the Syrian refugees to Jordan. A lot of them were allowed to move to the local communities. Housing prices increased tremendously. And so this actually created a cost for local communities. And the reason why this happened was because the supply for housing was restricted for a while, because the government was trying to decide whether or not, or they were worried that if they allowed the supply of housing to increase, that refugees will stay there longer. However, because the prices increased so quickly, the government quickly realized they needed to let supply kind of react and build more housing. And as soon as they did that, the prices went down. So I would say that the same is true for education. There is evidence of congestion in education when there is more refugee influx, but those are going to be minimized when there are adequate supply policies taken at the same time, like increasing infrastructure, giving more teachers, giving more funding to these regions, which is actually completely intuitive. Where we let the supply adjust, these effects, these negative effects tend to disappear. And I have not heard of any evidence for Sahel, fortunately.
Thanks. And then a couple of other super quick questions. I mean, you kind of alluded it to to it at the end of your presentation about there not being so much evidence on kind of what happens in the home countries where people leave. But I guess we had a couple of questions that maybe there might be some work on. So Juan asked about kind of any evidence that there is on the population that does remain, and if there has been anything on kind of the brain drain kind of hypothesis. And then Kai Cheng asked more of like a descriptive question about obviously a lot of refugees only represent kind of or in some cases a small proportion of the amount of people who actually stay. And obviously the majority of people normally do stay in the country, even if there is this kind of conflict going on or climate crisis, and whether there's any kind of facts about the type of people who stay and the type of people who leave, and if we know anything more about that.
Thank you. These are incredible questions. I think also my mind is going there as a researcher because I've seen that we don't know a lot about origin countries. So the majority of research on origin countries has focused on two topics. One is remittances. So basically, when people move, they send money back and how that impacts these countries. And the other one is brain drain and trying to understand how much of migration that kind of creates that problem if it is related to brain drain. Not that the most intelligent people and the people who are the most driven leave these countries. On the literature on brain drain, there seems to be an agreement that it's not truly a cost, but it actually creates benefits because these people actually return and kind of create businesses and have networks, and so that it's not a real cost for these countries. But other than that, there's very little research. So recently we wrote a paper with Nicolas Cabra and Michaela Sbiacci about Venezuela, because this is a country that has more data available, and I think that makes it possible to understand what was happening in municipalities that had a lot of forced displacement, and there we see profound negative effects on development. Basically, a depletion of factors of production, which is not surprising. 35% of the people in this country left. And the second thing that we document is that it is possible to perpetuate this situation because the people who leave are disproportionately opposition to the regime. And when they leave, they lose their political opposition and they reduce the possibility of social change. But I will invite you to read that paper. I would be happy to share it. And we're working on other papers there.
Thanks. And then maybe do you have time for two more quick questions? Or sure. Okay, so we had one from George who asks whether there's kind of been any evidence on the impact of kind of media narratives and how that impacts people's perceptions or feelings about migrants and refugees. We also had a question from Farah at Give Directly who basically asked whether there's any good measures that people can use to measure integration between refugees and host communities, like if there's kind of one specific kind of measure that can be used. And then we had a question from Abubakar who asked if there's kind of common gaps in the policy and legal frameworks that affect kind of forced migrants in different settings. So whether there's kind of typical examples of where refugees kind of fall through the gaps of policy and legal frameworks.
So on terms of media, yes, there is a lot of evidence on the negative effects of media actually. So a few papers have documented it is a very powerful instrument for moving social attitudes. So they have shown that, for example, by priming individuals to certain news, or they have shown that they react tremendously, at least in the short term, when you show them these news in the responses toward refugees. So there is kind of ample evidence that media is very effective in moving these attitudes. The second thing on integration, yes, there's all sorts of creative measurements. So some of them are just survey based, where you ask people, oh, from 1 to 5, would you have a neighbor who would be okay with having a refugee that is your neighbor, with having a refugee marry your daughter, with having policies that support refugees? So that's like very self-reported. But there are other measures that are more kind of objective, in which they ask you about your networks, they give you money and they ask you to donate money to different causes, and one of them is refugees. List experiments that have problems, but basically they try to measure kind of indirectly if you are willing to report that you don't like refugees. And And on the field, like actual interactions between these people by observations, not like measuring, oh, they're talking to them, etc. Or giving them bonuses to see if they go to dinner with other members of the community. So all of that is there. And then on in the legal framework, there is ample evidence, tremendous evidence on the fact that there has been tremendous progress on the jure, which means that the writing, the laws have progressed tremendously in many countries. But that's not directly translated on the fact of progressiveness. In a way, we go to the field and we see that they don't even know, or many didn't even know how to apply, that there's a lot of bureaucracy. So I think there is quite a bit of red tape to be resolved in many countries. One of them, for example, is Ethiopia. Colombia also, they have moved incredible steps and progress tremendously. But there's quite a bit of red tape that needs to be overcome when these laws are passed. And there is also one-on-one sentiments of discrimination that make it sometimes harder to reduce that red tape. Okay, and with that, I will finish. I know that we're out of time.
Thanks so much. And yeah, thanks again for today's incredible presentation, and also for the all of the work that you and the team did on the VoxDevLit. I've just put a link in the chat where you can go and download the full literature review. You can also download the slides from today's presentation, as well as the online table appendix that Sandra mentioned, which goes through all of those 250 papers and kind of pulls out the main takeaways from all of those. We will also be adding a recording of this session to the website alongside the VoxDevLit, so that if there's anyone you know who you would want to send this to, you can send it through to them at that link. So thanks again, Sandra, and we will